Alright, what we're going to do today in this lesson is we're going to talk about functions. And functions are part of the programming language that allow us to do a couple of things with our code. First of all, it allows us to organize it a little bit. Instead of having it spread all over the HTML, we can go ahead and put it up in the head section of the document and keep it in one place, so when we have to go back later and make changes, we don't have to spend time looking for it. It also allows us to control when things run a little bit more concisely. So what we can do is we can create chunks of code in a function up in the head section, and as long as it's a function, it won't run until something happens to tell it to run. So we might have code that does something, and when somebody clicks the executes the on-click event by pressing a button, then it would go up to the top of the page, find the code it needs to run, and go about its business. To this point, what we've done is we've had the on-click event, and we've had very simple programs, maybe one line of code that changes the background color or something like that. This allows us to have multiple lines of code that are executed by the on-click event. So an analogy that you might think about when you're talking about a function is making a cake. When you decide you want to make a cake, you go to the store and you buy eggs and sugar and flour, but those things don't happen. A cake doesn't automatically get baked when you create those things. So you have the output of the cake and the input of the ingredients, and what's in the middle is the function, which is a small tiny program in itself. It's going to be like a method that we've used already. It kind of allows us to write our own methods, and so we can control when the input comes in and when the output goes out using the function. So it's kind of like the recipe. It's the lines of code that tell the program what to do when we want it to do it. And so what we're going to do right now is talk basically about the generic appearance of a function. So again, this should be up in the head section of your document. You of course would have your script tags, and when you define a function, there are a couple of things you have to do. You're actually going to use the word function that lets the browser know not to execute it until it's told to execute it. And then you're going to give your function a name. The reason you're going to do that is because there are two steps to this process. You're going to define the function. In other words, you're going to write the program that tells the browser what exactly you want it to do. And then somewhere down in your code, you're going to call the function. And you need to name the function so you can call it at the appropriate time. It's not unheard of to have more than one function sitting up in the head section of the document where different parts of the page or different button clicks cause different functions to run. So we're going to go ahead and name this function, and we're going to stick with the same rules we followed when we named variables. Case is important, so I'm just going to give a generic name. So function name, and as I hinted before, it's kind of like writing our own methods. So when you define the function, you're going to go ahead and put those parentheses that we're so used to seeing there in the function definition. So when we use a function, if we need to send ingredients to the function, we can do it via these parentheses. Now when we define the function, all of the statements that we're actually going to execute are going to be in between opening and closing curly braces. The curly brace is to the right of the P, and you have to hit the shift key to get that. And so this, anything between here, is where we would write our statements. So that's the basic format of defining a function, and like I said, somewhere further down we would probably see the closing head, and we might see the body, and let's just say we're going to use the unload event to call this function. Not unload, onload. And if we're going to call this function using that event handler, we would just say that the onload attribute is going to be equal to, we give the function name that we're going to call, and we put those parentheses in. And that's our one line of code that we tie to the event handler. So the browser comes in, it sees the word function, and ignores this until it's told to do otherwise. It comes along, it hits the body tag, and it says, oh, once I get to the loading part, what I need to do is go up to the head section, find something called function name, and then execute the statements that are part of that function. So that's the generic format. What we're going to do in this lesson is we're going to go over a program We're going to have a drop-down list that lists websites we can go to, and when the user clicks the submit button, we're going to call a function that actually changes the location of the document and goes to the page that they've selected. So I'm going to switch on over to Dreamweaver. I'm going to create a new HTML document. Again, I'm using Dreamweaver because I can use some of the design functionalities to speed the process up a little bit. Since we're going to need a drop-down form, I'm going to go ahead and use that functionality in Dreamweaver to do it. So I'm going to go up to Insert. I'm going to come down to Form, and I'm going to tell it that I want to create a list menu. I'm going to give it a name, and it's very important because we're going to have to get information off of this list. And remember, our document object model says to do that, we'll go to the document, we'll go to the form that it's on, we'll find the control we're after, and then we can pull properties where we can execute methods on those. So in this case, I'm going to name this Next URL. Now pay attention to your capitalization too, because that can cause you problems. Remember, we need to make sure those match up. So we click OK. It's going to ask if I want to add a form tag. We say sure. When we do that, remember, Dreamweaver automatically names the form Form1, so we'll need that information later on too. And in addition to that, I'm going to go ahead and insert a button. I'm going to go to Insert Form. I'm going to go to Button. I'm going to name this Submit. Even though it's not going to act as a submit button, it's going to act as an anything button. So remember, in Dreamweaver, if you're using the form builder, you need to come down to the properties and change it from a submit button, which would execute the action on the form tag, to a none. And that'll allow us to add the on-click event, which will allow us to then run our function we're going to write. So before we go on, I'm going to do one more thing. I'm going to click back on the drop-down menu. And I'm going to show you how to add the options. If you remember from your form lab, you had options, and then you had two things. You could have the value of what was submitted when the form was submitted, and then in between the opening and closing option tag, you would have what actually showed up to the user in the list. And this little button down here in the properties area allows us to configure that. So I'm going to click there. I'm going to say the first thing they can go to is Google. So that's the item label, meaning what they'll see in the list. And the value I'm going to add to that is the actual URL of the website. Because what we're going to do is figure out what they've selected from the list, and we're going to retrieve this value and set that to the current location to make the document reload. So I'm going to add another option. I'm going to click the plus button. I'm going to say let's go to eBay. http://www.ebay.com, and let's add one more, Tarleton, and the value we're going to submit there is the web address of Tarleton. So we click OK. Our form is complete. I'm going to jump over to the code view. Notice the select is built out for us. Our option, the value is set to Google, and the word they'll actually see in the list is between the option tags. All right. So let's go ahead and define our function. I'm going to go up to the head section. I'm going to give myself a little bit of room to write. And so I'm going to open up the script tag and go ahead and cheat and have it fill that in for me. And I'm also going to close that script tag before I get started, so I don't forget to do that later on. All right, so we're going to talk through the code, and I'm going to show you something that depends on an array, which is something we haven't studied yet. We'll get to it in the next lesson, but I'll try to just explain this one instance as we go. So we're going to go ahead and set up our function. We're going to name it link menu. And we're going to go ahead and put in those parentheses, and I'm going to go ahead and pre-fill in my opening and closing curly braces, so again, I don't forget to do those. So I've defined function. Notice F is lowercase. A really common error is to make that F an uppercase, so be sure you don't do that. Here's the name of my function that I'm going to call later on, and then here is where I will actually set up the things that will happen if anybody ever clicks on that button. So the first thing I need to do is figure out what item they've actually selected from the list. Now the list, when it's set up, it numbers the options starting with 0. So in our case, Google is 0, eBay is 1, and Tarleton is 2. So we need to figure out, did they select the thing in the 0 spot, the 1 spot, or the 2 spot? Then we need to tell the program to go back into the list of options and retrieve the value of the item that they actually selected. And we have to do that in a two-part step. So the first thing we're going to do is set up a variable, and we're going to tell it that we want to set up a variable named selected link. And this is where we're going to figure out which one they actually clicked on. So we're going to go to the document, we're going to go to form 1, which is on that document. We're going to go to the control named next URL, and we're going to retrieve what's stored in one of the properties called selected index. And like I said before, what that does is that tells us that we are going to get that 0 or 1 or 2 value that that coincides with what they've selected. So the next thing we're going to do is we are going to use that information to go back into the document and retrieve that. But what I'm going to do first is I'm going to set this equal to location.href. If you remember back from the first lesson when we talked about properties of the windows in the document, this is actually one of the properties of the window. So it's really window.location.href. And what we're doing here is we're actually going to, on the fly, change the current location of the window. And that's basically changing the URL. So what it's going to do is it's going to forward us on to the page that we designate. And in this case, we're going to designate the URL to go to based on what they chose in the list. And the way we do that is we say go back to the document, go to form 1, go to next URL, and this time what I want you to do is go to the options. Now the options have a property called value, which is that URL we're trying to retrieve. But we need to tell it which option to choose, and we do that by using our selected link variable. And what we do is we're going to put that in brackets, and if I spell it correctly, it'll work a little bit better, dot value. So let me explain what happens here. If they select eBay, eBay is in the number 1 spot, Google's in the 0 spot, eBay's the 1 spot, and Tarleton's the 2 spot. So let's pretend they selected eBay off of our list. When our function runs here, what happens is we go to the document, we go to the control, and it tells us that we've selected what's in the number 1 spot. So the number 1 gets stored in this variable. So when we then try to tell it to go back to that and retrieve the associated value, we tell it to go to the document, go to the same form, go to the same control, go to the option, and substitute in the number of the one that they've selected and retrieve the value associated with that. And so then once it's done that, let's say in this case it's retrieved http://www.ebay.com, what it does is it substitutes that in for this whole mess here, and when we change the property to that new address, it'll automatically cause us to jump forward with that. So it looks like I have an error here somewhere. I don't have the coloring that I would expect on this. Actually, maybe it looks right, but we're going to find out. We might have to do a little bit of editing. So we're going to go give this a whirl. I'm going to go up to this toolbar here in Dreamweaver. I'm going to tell it to preview it in Firefox. And go ahead and save it. And we will wait until it loads up. And we're going to wait just a little bit longer than I thought we might. And I am not getting a browser for some reason. There it is. It was just hidden behind. So we have our list and we have our button here. So I say that I want to go to eBay. I click the button and look, nothing happens. And that's expected. The reason nothing happened is because we've only done step 1. We've only defined the function. Nowhere in our HTML do we tell it that we actually want to run that function. So what we have to do is come down here to our button. We give it the onClick attribute. We're going to tie it to that event handler, and we're going to say when they click on this button, we want you to go find link menu and run that program. So this time, hopefully, if we don't have any errors, we should see what happens. We click eBay and we click the button. This time it runs that function and then eBay eventually comes up. And again, if we go back, we tell it we want to go to Google instead. We click that button, it runs the function, and Google comes up. So that's the first example of functions. We're going to use them throughout the rest, a lot of the remaining examples, but I'm going to do another example in the next lesson using functions, but also going over some of the math functions that are available.